John held his son's hand firmly as they walked through the city's downtown streets. It was a special day, his wedding anniversary with his wife, Sarah. He wanted to surprise her with something unique, something that would show how much she meant to him and their family. With the little money he had, he decided to visit a luxury store, hoping to find something special to gift her. His heart was full of hope, and even though it was a modest gesture, he knew that what mattered most was the thought behind it. As soon as John entered the store, he felt the eyes of everyone around fall on him. Dressed in simple clothes, with his son beside him, who occasionally made noises due to his autism, he noticed that people around him began whispering. A sharply dressed salesman approached, but instead of a warm smile, there was judgment written all over his face. "May I help you?" the salesman asked, his voice cold, as if he already knew the answer, and was hoping John would leave soon. With a timid smile, John explained that he was looking for something special for his wife. The salesman let out a short, almost inaudible laugh, then glanced at the other employees, who seemed to be amused by the situation. "I'm sure you'll find something more within your budget at another store," the salesman said, casting a disdainful look at John's son, who was making repetitive hand movements. The humiliation wasn't just aimed at John, but also at his son, and it hit John in a way he never expected. John felt his blood boil. His first instinct was to leave immediately, but something kept him rooted in place. His son's sad and confused expression made him freeze for a moment. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension in the air. John took a deep breath, tried to stay calm, and with a shaky voice, thanked the salesman and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, he heard the muffled laughter of the staff behind him. Each chuckle felt like a stab, tearing at his dignity. Outside the store, John felt frustration well up and turn into tears. He looked at his son and hugged him tightly, feeling helpless. All he wanted was to do something nice for his family, but he had been treated as if he had no worth. "I promise you'll never have to go through this again," he murmured into his son's ear, his voice breaking. The promise wasn't just for his boy, but for himself. That humiliation would be the turning point in his life. Chapter 2. The frustration. John walked through the city streets, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The scene in the store still echoed in his mind, like a wound he couldn't stop touching. Frustration grew inside him, mixed with a sense of helplessness. He knew that as a father, his role was to protect his son and provide the best for his family. Yet, in that moment, he felt small, as if all his efforts weren't enough to escape society's cruel judgment. He looked at his son, who was still distracted by his repetitive movements, unaware of the depth of the situation. John felt a sharp pain in his chest, a mix of sadness and anger. It wasn't just about the humiliation he had suffered, but also about the prejudice against his son, the disdainful looks because he was different. Every time John thought about it, the weight of frustration grew heavier. He had faced tough moments before, but this experience made him question his worth as a father and as a man. Back home, John could barely hide his sadness. Sarah, his wife, quickly noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked, concerned, as she watched his distant gaze. He wanted to tell her everything, but he felt an internal barrier. How could he explain that once again, he hadn't been able to protect their family from such a humiliating situation? Frustration filled his voice as he simply muttered, "Nothing. Just a tough day." John spent the night in silence, replaying every moment of that day in his mind. He knew he had to do something to change this situation, but all his previous attempts had been in vain. He had worked hard his whole life, yet it seemed like fate always placed him in situations that reinforced his helplessness. The world felt like a cold and unfair place, where the powerful trampled on the weak without remorse. As he lay in bed, his thoughts consumed him. What could he do to ensure his son was never treated that way again? The feeling of frustration was unbearable, but at the same time, a small spark began to grow within him, a deep desire to change his reality. He knew the promise he made to his son couldn't just be empty words. For the first time in a long while, John felt something different, a growing determination. Chapter 3. The promise. John woke up early that morning, but instead of feeling the usual weight of routine, something was different. As he watched his son play innocently with his favorite toys, he realized that the promise he had made the day before wasn't just an emotional reaction. It was something deeper, a commitment he had to honor, not only for his son, but for himself. That humiliation couldn't be the end of his story. It would be the beginning of a transformation. He sat beside the boy and observed him for a few moments. Every smile and every movement was a reminder that, despite the hardships, his son was the reason John kept fighting. "I'm going to change this, son. I promise you'll never go through something like that again. No one will ever look down on us again." As he spoke those words, he felt a strength growing inside him. It was as if, for the first time, he had found a purpose that truly mattered. John knew that if he wanted to keep this promise, he would need to transform his life. It wasn't enough to keep struggling day after day in jobs that barely supported his family. He needed more. He needed to provide a life of dignity for Sarah and his son, a life where they wouldn't be judged by appearances or by his son's condition. The world needed to see them for who they really were, a strong and resilient family. In the days that followed, John spent hours searching for opportunities, thinking about how he could change his financial situation. He didn't have much business experience, but something inside him told him that this was the key to transforming his life. He began studying entrepreneurship, reading books and watching videos online during the late hours when the house was quiet, and he finally had some time to himself. Each new piece of information sparked a new flame of hope. John began to visualize a different future, where he could create his own business and maybe even find success. He knew it would be a difficult journey, full of challenges and obstacles, but the promise he made to his son was his constant motivation. He had been knocked down many times in life, but now something inside him wouldn't let him give up. Each day, John reinforced the promise in his heart. He was going to change his family's story, not out of revenge, not to prove something to others, but to ensure his son could grow up in a more just and welcoming world. This was his mission, and he was willing to do whatever it took to fulfill it. Chapter 4. The first failure. With the promise to his son still alive in his heart, John decided it was time to take action. He had learned the basics of business, and with the little money he had saved, took a risk by opening his first small business. It was a modest venture, but filled with hope. A convenience store in a nearby neighborhood. John believed that if he worked hard and dedicated himself, he could finally start building the future he had promised. In the first few months, the optimism was palpable. He woke up early every day, greeted his customers with a smile, and dedicated every minute to the business. Sarah supported him, believing that this could be the first step toward change. But as time went on, John began to realize that things weren't going as he had hoped. The competition in the area was tough, and the traffic in his store was not enough to cover the costs. John did everything he could. He spent sleepless nights trying to think of ways to attract more customers. He invested the little money he had in advertising, organized promotions, but the results didn't come. The stress began to weigh on him, and the frustration returned. Every time he looked at his son, he remembered the promise he made, and the feeling of failure crushed him. "How can I change our lives if I can't even keep a store open?" he asked himself silently, feeling the tears well up in his eyes. After 6 months of relentless efforts, John had no choice but to close the doors of his store. The reality was harsh. He had failed. He went home that day feeling defeated, not knowing how to tell Sarah that all the effort had been in vain. When she asked about his day, he simply lowered his head and, with a sigh, explained that the business had gone under. Sarah hugged him in silence, but he could feel the disappointment in the air, even though she said nothing. John spent the next few days sunk in dark thoughts. All he wanted was to keep his promise, but it seemed that no matter how hard he tried, the world was always ready to knock him down. He felt like he was losing the fight before it had even really started. The frustration was immense, but the worst part was knowing he had put his family in an even more difficult situation. But deep in his pain, something remained. The promise he made to his son couldn't be broken. Even with the crushing failure, John knew that he hadn't reached the end yet. He took a deep breath and though the fear of failing again consumed him, he decided he would try one more time. Failure would not be the end of his story. Chapter 5. The second failure. Determined not to let the previous failure define his life, John decided to try again. He knew the lessons from the first business couldn't be wasted. With the promise to his son still vivid in his mind, he gathered what was left of his savings and launched a new venture, this time believing he had learned from his mistakes. The idea now was a small family restaurant, something he thought would have a better chance of success. The beginning was promising. John managed to attract customers with a simple menu and a cozy atmosphere. Sarah helped him on weekends, and even their son seemed more excited to see his dad working on something new. For a brief moment, John believed he had finally found the right path. However, life once again had other plans. The economy was unstable, and the costs of running the restaurant began to rise uncontrollably. Suppliers raised their prices, taxes seemed endless, and soon the customer flow began to dwindle. John tried everything to keep the business afloat. He ran promotions, cut expenses, and even worked longer hours, but the weight of the debt became unbearable. Each day felt like a losing battle, and he started to feel the same cycle of frustration that had consumed him before. The restaurant, which initially seemed like a good idea, began to suffocate John. He could barely sleep, worried about the bills and the possibility of failing once again. The feeling of failure haunted him, and this time it was even more painful. How could he keep trying when everything he did seemed to crumble before his eyes? When the restaurant finally closed its doors, John found himself in an even worse situation than before. Not only had he failed again, but now he was buried in debt and felt there was no way out. No one around him believed he could get back on his feet, and even Sarah, despite her quiet support, began to show signs of concern about the family's future. John looked at his son and felt like a failure as a father. How could he keep the promise he had made? How could he ensure his son would never again face the prejudice they had suffered when he couldn't even keep the family stable? The darkness of frustration seemed to take over every aspect of his life. He wanted to give up, leave everything behind, and accept defeat. But something kept him from completely falling. Despite everything, despite the 2 consecutive failures, that promise to his son still burned inside him. He knew that even in the face of all adversity, he couldn't give up. But this time, John realized he couldn't continue alone. He needed something bigger to guide him, something that would give meaning to his next step. The prayer and the mentor. After the second failure, John felt like he had hit rock bottom. The 2 failed businesses had left deep scars on his soul, and with each frustrated attempt, the weight of the promise he made to his son became more unbearable. It was as if every failure reinforced the idea that he would never be able to give his family the life he so desperately wanted. His faith, once unshakable, now felt distant, almost unreachable. One night, alone in his room, while Sarah and his son slept, John fell to his knees beside the bed. He felt like he had no strength left. He closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face, and for the first time in a long while, he spoke to God. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I've tried everything, but I keep failing. Please, show me the way. I can't go on alone. I need help." The silence that followed felt endless, but John felt a peace wash over his heart. Something inside him told him that things would change, that he wasn't alone, even if everything seemed lost. He rose from the prayer feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in months, as if his prayer had been heard. The next morning, still shaken by the emotions of the night before, John decided to go out and clear his head. Walking aimlessly through the city, he eventually stopped at a small cafe. He sat at a corner table and ordered a coffee, trying to gather his thoughts. It was then that an older man with a calm demeanor and deep, thoughtful eyes approached and asked if he could join him. "It looks like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, young man," the man said with a gentle smile. John, surprised by the approach, stayed silent for a moment. Something in the man's gaze made him feel at ease. He didn't know why, but he started sharing his story. The 2 failed businesses, the prejudice he had faced with his son, the promise he had made, and the desperation of not knowing how to move forward. The man listened attentively, never interrupting. When John finished, he smiled again and said, "Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the hardest times. I've been where you are now. The secret isn't in what you've done so far, but in what you'll do from here on out. If you're willing to learn, I can help you." John was stunned. Who was this man? He didn't know what to think, but something inside him felt that this encounter wasn't a coincidence. The mentor, as John would come to call him, became a key figure in his life. He began teaching John how to run a business efficiently, understand the market, and make more strategic decisions. But more than that, he helped him restore his confidence and strengthen his faith. Slowly, John began to realize that failure wasn't the end. It was a lesson, a step on the ladder to success. And with the mentor's support, he was ready to try again, this time with the certainty that he was on the right path. Chapter 7. The Growth. With the mentor's guidance, John began to see the business world through new eyes. He now understood that it wasn't just about working hard, but about working smart. Every piece of advice from the mentor became a valuable tool to transform his life, and more importantly, fulfill the promise he had made to his son. He knew he couldn't fail this time, not for himself, but for his family. This time, John decided to invest in a business that not only had growth potential, but also reflected the values he believed in. Inspired by his mentor, he started a consulting firm aimed at helping small entrepreneurs, guiding them to avoid the mistakes he had made in the past. It was a bold decision, but John knew he could make a difference in the lives of others who, like him, struggled to succeed. Growth was slow but steady. John applied every lesson from the mentor with discipline and patience. He knew success wouldn't come overnight, but he was willing to wait and build something solid. His company began to gain recognition, and soon he was sought out by entrepreneurs needing guidance for their own businesses. John, now with a new perspective on life, felt confident and ready to help others thrive. As the months passed, John began to see the fruits of his labor. His business wasn't just growing in terms of profit, but also in impact. He established important partnerships, expanded his services, and for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his life. What once seemed impossible was now becoming a reality. His son, who had been the initial reason for his determination, was growing up watching his father with admiration, learning about resilience and overcoming challenges. John's journey wasn't just professional but spiritual as well. He began to reconnect with his faith, recognizing that he couldn't have come this far without the help of God and the mentor. On several occasions, he thought back to the prayer he had made on that night of despair when he was on the verge of giving up. Now, looking at his life, he saw that that prayer had been answered in ways he never imagined. As his business flourished, John began investing in social projects focused on families with autistic children, like his own. He wanted other families to have the support and resources needed to navigate the challenges he had faced. His story of struggle and triumph began to inspire others, and John realized that his success wasn't just about making money, but about fulfilling the purpose that God had placed in his heart. Now, John was about to take the next step, returning to the store where it all began. He knew this would be the opportunity to close a chapter in his life and show that prejudice and humiliation could not define his destiny. Chapter 8. The Triumphant Return. Years had passed since that day when John walked out of the luxury store, humiliated, holding his son's hand and carrying a promise in his heart that once seemed impossible to fulfill. But now, everything was different. John had transformed his life. His family was thriving, and he was the head of a successful business. The promise to his son had been kept, and the cycle of pain and frustration that had once consumed him was finally coming to an end. That morning, as he got dressed for a special appointment, John felt a mix of emotions. He knew the day would be important. For the first time since that humiliation, he would return to the store that marked the beginning of his transformation. This time, however, he wasn't the humble man who had been ridiculed. He was a successful businessman, known for his determination and his work supporting families with autistic children. But more importantly, he was a father who had kept his promise. As he entered the store, the atmosphere was the same as before. luxurious and filled with well-dressed customers, but this time John felt at ease. Beside him, his son, now a confident teenager, accompanied him. As they crossed the threshold, the looks still turned their way, but not with disdain or judgment. John walked with confidence, each step reinforcing his self-assurance. He knew this moment symbolized much more than just a visit. It was the culmination of a journey of overcoming. As he approached the counter, John was greeted by an employee who, unaware of who he was, treated him with respect and courtesy. It was different from the last time, but John knew that this treatment wasn't enough to heal the wounds of the past. He wanted something more. When the store manager, the same man who had looked down on him years ago, approached to greet him, John felt a wave of emotions wash over him. But instead of anger or revenge, he felt compassion. "Can I help you with something special?" the manager asked, still not recognizing who stood before him. John looked calmly at him and with a subtle smile replied, "Yes, I'm interested in buying this store." The words dropped like a bomb. The manager stood still for a few seconds, unable to believe what he had just heard. John continued, explaining that he had analyzed the market and knew the store was going through financial difficulties. He made an offer to buy the store, an offer that, given the circumstances, couldn't be refused. The manager, still stunned, asked for a moment and went to the office to discuss the proposal with the partners. John remained calm, standing beside his son as they waited. He knew that buying the store wasn't just a business transaction, it was a way to show the world and himself that no one could determine his worth based on appearances or prejudice. A few minutes later, the manager returned, now with a different expression on his face. He informed John that the offer had been accepted. Without any arrogance or desire for revenge, John thanked him and proceeded with the acquisition process. There was no need to humiliate anyone. The simple fact of being there, buying the store that had once rejected him, was proof that he had won, and more importantly, he had won with dignity. Chapter 9. The Redemption. After the purchase of the store was finalized, John knew his mission went far beyond simply acquiring a luxury space. For him, this was an opportunity to transform the place where he and his son had been humiliated into a symbol of inclusion, respect, and empathy. He didn't just want to run a business. He wanted to impact lives and ensure that no one else would go through the painful experience he and his son had endured. Soon after taking over the store, John began implementing significant changes. The first was a complete overhaul of the customer service policy. Every employee, old and new, would undergo training focused on respect, inclusion, and equal treatment for all customers. He hired experts in inclusive customer service, bringing in speakers and psychologists to talk about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their appearance, financial status, or life situation. At first, the store employees were skeptical, but they soon began to notice the change in the culture of the place. Under John's leadership, the store became more than just a place of commerce. It transformed into a welcoming and respectful environment. Customers from all walks of life, including families with autistic children, began to frequent the store, feeling valued and respected. John made a point of talking to the families, often sharing his own experience, which created a deep connection with the customers. But the changes didn't stop there. John also implemented an inclusion program for people with disabilities, offering employment opportunities to those who were often marginalized in the workforce. He knew that inclusion had to go beyond customer service. It had to be present at every level of the company. Employees who once looked down on John and his son were now working side by side with people facing similar challenges, learning to value and respect differences. However, the most symbolic moment of John's redemption came when he called the manager, the one who had laughed at him years before, for a conversation. The man, now visibly humbled, expected John to fire him, perhaps even with a bit of humiliation. But John had other plans. In a calm voice, he said, "I could treat you the same way you treated me, but that wouldn't change anything. What I want is for you to learn from the past, just as I've learned from my defeats. If you're willing to change and learn, there's a place for you here." The manager, visibly emotional, accepted the opportunity for redemption. From that day on, he committed himself to being a different leader, more empathetic and attentive to the needs of both customers and employees. The transformation of the store and the people involved became visible each day, and John felt at peace, knowing that his victory didn't come through revenge, but through compassion and a desire to create a better environment for everyone. John knew that, in the end, the true victory was seeing the change in the world around him, and, most importantly, seeing the promise he had made to his son fully and truly fulfilled. Chapter 10. The Silent Victory. After months of hard work and deep changes in the store, John finally felt that his mission was complete. He had transformed that space not just into a thriving business, but into a place where every person, regardless of their appearance, social status, or limitations, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. However, the greatest transformation wasn't in the store's numbers or the renovated facade. The real change happened within John and around him. John looked at his son, who now walked beside him through the store, with the confidence of someone who knew they were loved and accepted just as they were. The prejudice they had faced had been painful, but it had also been the catalyst for a deep transformation. John had kept his promise to his son. They would never again be treated with disdain or humiliation. They had overcome it together, and that was all that mattered. John's financial success was undeniable. His company continued to grow. His efforts in the community were widely recognized, and the store that he had once left with his head down was now his, reimagined and thriving. But despite all of this, John didn't seek recognition or the spotlight. For him, the greatest victory wasn't in acquiring the store or overcoming prejudice, but in the peace he felt watching his son grow up in a more just and welcoming world. There were many opportunities when John could have used his position to humiliate or look down on those who had mistreated him, but he chose the path of compassion and forgiveness. He knew that true power didn't lie in returning harm, but in being able to overcome adversity with dignity and wisdom. His victory was quiet but profound, and it touched the lives of many people around him. As John walked through the store, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The road had been full of failures, frustrations, and moments of despair, but every obstacle had prepared him for this moment. He had not only become a successful businessman, but a man of unwavering faith, who believed in the power of transformation and the strength of forgiveness. In that moment of reflection, he turned to his son and smiled. "We did it, kid, we did it together." The boy looked at his father and smiled back, no words needed. John knew that his son had not only learned from him, but had also taught him. Their journey was living proof that love and determination could overcome any challenge, and that with faith and effort, it was possible to transform the world around them. And so, without fanfare, John left the store that day with the certainty that his victory was more than material. It was etched in the hearts of those he had impacted, and especially in the heart of his son. The cycle had been closed, and the promise fulfilled. Reflection. Humiliation does not define your worth. In life, we all face difficult moments. Some of us carry scars from humiliations, rejections, and injustices that have left deep marks on our souls. John's story is a living example of someone who was humiliated, rejected, and underestimated. However, what defines a person is not the humiliation they suffer, but how they choose to respond to those painful moments. Often, the world tries to tell us that we are not enough, that our appearance, our way of living, or our circumstances make us inferior. But just as John made a promise to himself and his son, you too can promise yourself that this humiliation will not be the end of your story. The pain you feel now can be the fuel for your transformation. John had two choices when he faced scorn: to give up or to fight. He chose to fight. He chose to believe that, despite the circumstances, his worth as a person was far greater than what others could see. And this is something we can all learn. The world may judge us by the surface, but it's our heart, our faith, and our determination that truly matter. When humiliation comes, don't let it define who you are. Remember that moments of pain are temporary, but the strength you build by overcoming them can last forever. John had many reasons to give up: failures, rejections, closed doors, but he knew his victory lay in perseverance. He knew that with faith and effort it was possible to turn what seemed like the end of the road into a new beginning. You can overcome too. It doesn't matter how many times life knocks you down. What matters is how many times you choose to get back up. If you have a dream, a purpose, or a promise you've made to yourself or to those you love, hold on to it tightly. Your journey may be difficult and the obstacles may seem insurmountable, but never forget, what lies ahead is greater than what hurt you. Just as John turned his pain into victory, so can you. The humiliation you face today may be the start of your greatest transformation. Don't give up. Don't let the judgment of others dim the light within you. True victory lies in not letting difficult moments define you, but in using those moments to build something bigger and stronger. Remember, humiliation is just a chapter, not the end of your story. God sees what others cannot. Keep fighting, because your victory is closer than you think.